Hello, my name is Dr. Amber Hughes. This is the 7th episode of this career counseling series. In this episode, I'm going to talk about career issues for diverse populations. In the last episode, I talked about career counseling for diverse populations. I pointed out that the best way to be a multicultural career counselor is not necessarily to know about every culture out there. That being said, a lot of career counseling is about educating our clients about career issues. So in this episode, we are going to look at just a few career issues for certain populations. We're going to start with that infamous gender pay gap I mentioned in the last episode. I want to look at it a bit in more detail now, and if you're watching the video version of this, or if you're taking a look at the PowerPoint, I've got a chart here for you looking at earnings. According to data from 2015, white women make about 75% of what white men make. Black women, however, make about 63% of what white men make. And then, as I mentioned in the last episode, Hispanic or Latina women make a whopping 54% of what white men make. So while the gender wage gap is significant for all women, intersectional women face even greater challenges in terms of earnings. And I think if we acknowledge that a certain percent of the population, Hispanic women, make 54 cents on the dollar to a white man, I think that is beyond ridiculous, beyond fair, and it's something that needs to be considered. So again, while the gender wage gap is significant for all women, intersectional women face even greater challenges in terms of earnings. So it's important to consider those multiple categories that people fit into and how they play a part in discrimination. Now, this wage gap is complex, okay? And some people will say that it doesn't necessarily exist. While there is a wage gap, even when we look at earnings job by job, okay, so I think that's one of the arguments, is that that's not the case, that we're looking at different jobs. There is still a wage gap when we look at earnings job by job. The significant gap is there because of multiple issues. We see that women outnumber men in low-wage jobs, constituting 57% of workers paid under $15 per hour, and they make up the majority of low-wage workers in each state. Women's concentration in occupations and sectors with relatively low pay is a major factor behind the gender pay gap. Women have lower earnings both because occupations that mainly employ women tend to have lower earnings than occupations that mainly employ men, for any worker in that occupation, whether they are men or women. So if you're looking at like human services fields, which is what you're all in, likely if you're taking this class, you'll know that the pay in human services fields isn't great. And it's a woman-dominated field. So it doesn't matter if a man works in a human services field, he's still going to make as much as a woman does. But the fact that it's a female-dominated field is impacting that gender wage gap, okay? And then when we look at fields that are typically dominated by men, like engineering, the STEM fields, those wages are significantly higher. Personally, I think, that right there is an issue of discrimination. Just looking at education requirements, in order to be a counselor, in order to be a nurse, in order to be a teacher, you have to go through quite a bit of standards, right? Nursing is typically a really difficult program to get into. Counseling, you have to have a master's degree. Social work, in order to do, counseling, therapy, you have to have a master's degree. So we're looking at a significant amount of training. In order to be a teacher, you have to pass multiple tests to get certified. So there's quite a bit of standards there in place, quite a bit of education required for a field that's traditionally low paying, which to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially considering the type of work we do. Of course, I'm biased, right? We also see that women face sex discrimination. So just flat out discrimination is part of the problem. They earn less than men when they work in the same occupation. This is especially true for women of color who face additional discrimination because of their racial or ethnic identity. And finally, I want to point out that women are on the rise as breadwinners. So the issue of women earning less than men is as much a family issue as it is a women's issue. And so we're seeing the entire family be impacted by this gender wage gap, particularly whenever the women are the breadwinners. And so the whole family is depending on their money. And so it's making less and less sense that this is still a thing. Excuse me. In addition to these pay differences, women also face issues like discrimination and harassment in the workplace. So again, if you're taking a look at the PowerPoint or you're watching this as a video, I've got some links to articles about this. If you're listening to the podcast version of this episode, I've got a lot of resources and whatnot in this PowerPoint, so you still want to maybe pull it, download it, and take a look at it. Like I said, I've got links and citations in it. So what we're seeing is, and this is an article from feminist.org, is that there is a glass ceiling. And it's very real. Okay. So this means that women are kept from advancing to top positions simply because they are women. While this may be less apparent in female-dominated fields like teaching and counseling, it's very real even in those settings. Okay, so when I talk about this type of thing, I typically teach women. However, there are a lot of women who don't see it or don't experience the issues, and that I think happens for a couple of reasons. First of all, you just may not be experiencing it, and that's awesome. Second of all, you may not be as concerned about it. Totally fine too, right? Not everybody has to be on board with women's rights, or even passionate about it. You can totally be on board with it without being, without seeing it everywhere. What is also happening, I think, is that when we don't see it directly, or we don't experience it directly, or we don't know that that's what's happening, then it's harder to see. Okay. I read something, and I can't remember where I read it, that women tend to not face discrimination early on in their careers. It's only whenever they get to a point where they're trying to climb up the ladder, so to speak, or they're reaching a certain age where you really see that discrimination more so. I read one article it was talking about higher ed, and the woman was talking about how she started off in higher education as a professor, and most of the people that she worked with, most of her colleagues were men. There were a couple of women. Well, she was warned early on not to befriend the women because they were bitches, they were mean, they were grumpy. She just was warned not to seek mentorship from them. And so she did. She avoided them. She was young, she was coming up, and everybody liked her. All the men liked her. She was, agreeable. She was trying to get tenure, so there's a certain level of agreeableness there. And then once she reached a certain point in her career where she had gotten tenure, and she was probably starting to be a little bit more of an advocate for herself, all of a sudden everybody starts calling her a bitch, and she realized that it wasn't that the women who had a certain position in the department, it wasn't that they were actually bitches. It was that they were seen that way. Okay. Again, because they've got tenure, because maybe they're not, they're standing up for themselves a little bit more. And that's the kind of thing we see. It's when you get to a certain level in your career, that this tends to be even more apparent. When you start to, when you start to climb the ladder again, so to speak, we see it as being even more apparent there. So I mentioned in female-dominated fields, it seems like it's not very apparent, like teaching and counseling, and I hear that a lot as well. My supervisor's a woman, there's women all around me holding positions of power. I would encourage you to just look a little bit closer, okay? So while your direct supervisor or superior may be a woman, it's very likely that, if you're working in a counseling organization, that the CEO of the company is probably a man, or your superintendent is still a man if you're working in education. That may not be the case, and if not, awesome. But I would say that that there's still a significant amount of men who have who take on those high leadership roles. We also see that sexual harassment is still a fairly significant issue. Recently, and I'm recording this over the summer, okay, so you'll have to bear with me. But recently, in the government, this became an issue. The healthcare bill was up for debate and vote in the Senate. And this vote turned into an example of sexual harassment when there were two female Republican senators. They faced some fairly vicious language that was specific to their gender, because they would not vote for the Republican healthcare bill. And while you could certainly argue that if they were men, they would have faced the same amount of language, I would say maybe not. So, for example, when John McCain came out and said he was going to vote no, he didn't get a whole lot of threats. He got calls, he got asked to change his mind. He wasn't threatened outright. And certainly that happens when it's, whenever a man is going against the party vote. But types of language that's used, the freedom to use this language tends to be more apparent when we're looking at women in these types of positions versus men. And then finally, we need to consider things like work-life balance. Okay. For example, when we look at sick leave, more than 40% of private sector workers in the United States have no access to paid sick days. And if we're looking at, if we're considering the fact that most of the people who work in low-wage jobs are women, that's going to be even more significant, right? So we're looking at women who are working in low-wage jobs and who have no access to paid sick days. And these are the people who are also having babies. That's impossible, right? How do you have a child and not take sick days? And so you're going to be punished essentially for having a child, or you're going to have to go back to work much earlier than you should. Okay, so it's complex, right? So I understand why some people are probably thinking that this is just kind of being made up, or that it's not really an issue, or it's not, it's their own fault maybe for, working in a low wage jobs, or for having kids if they're in a low wage jobs. But I think we need to consider the fact that women are essentially in some ways being punished for being women, and that's what sexism is. Okay. And then, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we know that even though more and more women are primary breadwinners, they still do more housework than men, even when they work full-time or, again, are the primary breadwinners. Sometimes even when the men are the stay-at-home caretakers. And so that's a problem when we look at, when we consider as career counselors, things like work-life balance and how do you counsel someone who is experiencing these things, right? So again, these are kind of a brief look at a variety of issues that are gender-specific, so that we can be aware of these things whenever we work with women who are in the workplace. Now, there are some very specific issues that men face when it comes to working. For example, many men face discrimination if they aren't the breadwinner of the family, which, like I said, is becoming more and more the case, and especially if they choose to stay home to take care of the family. Men are also much less likely to have family leave available to them when they bring a new member into the household. If a woman has maternity leave available to her, it's even less likely than a man is going to have paternity leave available to him. Okay. So women aren't the only ones to have career-related issues, but their issues are significantly greater than the ones men face right now. So we kind of focus on those. The next population I want to consider is our individuals who identify as LGBT or T. Currently, LGBT individuals are afforded no legal protections against discrimination at the federal level. And again, I'm recording this in the summer, and this was something that was just passed. Several states have also passed laws allowing for discrimination based on religious beliefs. Some of those laws are specific to counseling. For example, Tennessee has passed a law saying that counselors can discriminate based on religious beliefs. Additionally, individuals who identify as LGBT face harassment and discrimination in the workplace, as well as significant life choices they make as a result of a fear of discrimination. For example, I had a former student who is gay and living in rural Appalachia. He shared that he decided to go into counseling partly because of his sexual orientation. He had originally wanted to be an elementary school counselor, but was afraid he would face accusations of child molestation because of his sexual orientation. Another example is a colleague of mine who was recently applying for jobs. He applied to some institutions in areas that he feared were not accepting of LGBT individuals, so he started asking before he even submitted his application if the institution and the community was a place he would be accepted and supported if he were to work there. Otherwise, he simply would not apply. He was forced, though he was fortunate, keep in mind he was fortunate to have the ability to be picky about where he applied, but he was still forced to consider these things as part of his job search. And so these are those other things that are sometimes hard to quantify whenever we're working with diverse populations, right? We don't necessarily have any statistics for fear of discrimination or for life changes. We just have these stories. And so those are the things that are a little bit harder to know about or to consider whenever you're working with certain populations. But this is why those doing that multicultural career counseling is that much more important to make sure that we are really getting the full picture of what's going on with the individual. While LGBT individuals do receive some protections through the right to marry at the federal level, and in some cases organizations have anti-discrimination policies, they do still face discrimination in the workplace. Some of it, and I think it's in one of these articles that I have posted a link for you to, some of it's similar to gender discrimination. So someone talks about he's a man, and a lot of, in his workplace, a lot of networking and things like that happen outside of work, like going out for drinks or going out for dinner after work. And women are often not invited to those, to participate in those activities. And he states that gay men are also excluded from those activities as well. Okay. So we see things like that happen in the workplace where he's, I think they called it the lavender ceiling, where LGBT individuals are kept from advancing after a certain point. And a lot of it's that kind of, some of it's outright discrimination and some of it's not. Some of it's that unintentional discrimination because of exclusion. Okay. In terms of career development, we see that LGBT individuals may have delayed career development because they first must work through their sexual orientation identity. So we see a lot of career development going on in adolescence. And if you are a lesbian or gay or bisexual, you're going to be focusing on your sexual orientation in your adolescence, more so than if you were straight. And so you may postpone that career development. Or gender identity in the case of trans individuals. That's going to be something where your attention and your energy is focused versus on your career. Individuals with a sexual orientation of G, L, or B continue to be stereotyped as to the kinds of jobs they should hold. They're often threatened by violence, often resulting from homophobia. They form a dislike for themselves through internalized homophobia. So, and that's part of that identity development that LGBT individuals must go through, and generally receive negative feedback from a society that views heterosexuality as the only viable lifestyle. Finally, LGBT individuals may fear disclosing their sexual orientation or their gender identity in the counseling setting, even though this part of their identity can play a big part of their career development. Some discrimination against LGBT individuals may include Some of it I have mentioned already: threats, lack of promotion, blackmail, ostracism, sexual harassment, excludence or avoidance, and termination, because that is legal, actually, in most places, and that lavender ceiling that I mentioned. All right, next, I want to talk about individuals with disabilities. So 1 in 5 Americans has some type of disability, so we're looking at a significant number of the population. People with disabilities are twice as likely to live below the poverty line. Special problems and needs of individuals with disabilities include difficulty adjusting to and accepting physical disabilities, okay, attitudinal barriers, being labeled disabled or handicapped, a lack of role models, the onset of disabilities, so when it hits you, basically. So there are some disabilities, some very significant disabilities, that don't come on until later in life. So if you're looking at something like, I think, multiple sclerosis, it may be an issue, it may not be an issue. Sometimes it's a bigger issue than others. Sometimes you don't know you have it until later on, and so you might have a life without a disability, and then boom, you have one. One of my close friends from high school found out she had, I forget what it was. It was some sort of blood disorder, I believe, was causing her some issues, and then she had a stroke because of it, and was paralyzed for some time from the, she couldn't walk, and she's 35 years old. And so that has been obviously a huge change for her, and something that she didn't even know about, didn't even know, was something that she had, and then boom, here it is. Now she's having to relearn to walk. She just got her driver's license back, so that's exciting. So she's doing well, but these disabilities are, sometimes it's more than the disability, right? Whenever it's something that happens later on, we have that adjustment to it as well. And not just the mental adjustment, the physical adjustment, if it's a physical disability. Social interpersonal skills can be an issue. Self-concept can be an issue. Skills for independent living, and then architectural barriers, so barriers to getting into buildings. And some of these are specific to individuals with physical disabilities. People with disabilities you can't see necessarily can have even more problems. Because those disabilities are sometimes not acknowledged, or people don't understand the impact of them, and they can create some very real challenges as well. Educational programs that develop a better understanding of the special problems are needed by both employers and families. The Americans with Disabilities Act affords individuals some protections by law. It was passed in 1990. The passage of ADA has focused more attention on career counseling programs designed especially to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities. ADA is a comprehensive document that covers several subjects significant to the rights of individuals with disabilities, including fair employment practices and access to public accommodations and transportations. And at the University of Tennessee, this is where I did my PhD, they have this awesome Disability Career Resources Center. They have a counselor who just works with individuals with disability, which is unique for one, but super awesome, because they give special attention to this population, and it is a growing population in higher ed, so there's a need for that. However, all of this does not account for those other issues, and some of those I mentioned before, that individuals may face as, for example, buildings are not up to code in terms of accessibility. How do you get into a building? And just think about these little things, right? That if you do not have a disability, you don't have to think about. But if you're going for a job interview and you get to the building and it's not accessible, what do you do? How do you get to your meeting? The fact, and some of this may, can be solved with maybe some self-disclosure before you when you're in the application process, certainly that can help with that. But the fact that that in and of itself is an issue. When do you disclose? How do you disclose that information? The fact that individuals with disabilities are often forced to advocate for themselves on a daily basis, I imagine would be simply exhausting. If individuals are dependent on federal money for care and services, for example, when the funding for these services is up for debate, this adds an even greater stressor on the person. So career counseling may involve consideration of these other issues that seem to be on the more personal side of counseling, but are just as important. And I've pointed out those, just giving some brief examples of those other issues that individuals may face, that again, we can't really quantify by looking simply at statistics, because that's a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about. We're not necessarily going to be talking about the laws, even though we may be surrounding the particular population we're working with. We're going to be talking about this other stuff, what it's like to live as a person who is you. And who fits into these nice categories we have, but just because you're in a category doesn't mean you aren't a unique person, and things look different for you. And so we have to understand that the person in front of us is unique, but also understand that these things are complex, and we should be open to listening to the person in front of us. Race is often the issue we consider first in terms of career issues related to diverse populations. For example, there's the potential for racial inequality and discrimination, as well as salary and job security inequities, keeping in mind the intersectionality issue I have mentioned. We typically see lower unemployment for whites and Asians and higher unemployment rates for African American and Hispanic individuals. Also, African American and Hispanic men and women are concentrated in non-standard positions, such as temporary and on-call work, that yield lower pay and benefits. Another issue individuals from a racial or ethnic minority may face is related to school and how they are treated. I watched a TED Talk recently that I want to play a clip from. The speaker is Alice Goffman. She's a sociologist. And the title is How We Are Priming Some Kids for College and Others for Prison. I'm just going to play a brief clip of this.
On the path that American children travel to adulthood, two institutions oversee the journey. The first is the one we hear a lot about, college. Some of you may remember the excitement that you felt when you first set off for college. Some of you may be in college right now, and you're feeling this excitement at this very moment. College has some shortcomings. It's expensive. It leaves young people in debt. But all in all, it's a pretty good path. Young people emerge from college with pride and with great friends and with a lot of knowledge about the world, and perhaps most importantly, a better chance in the labor market than they had before they got there. Today I want to talk about the second institution overseeing the journey from childhood to adulthood in the United States, and that institution is prison. Young people on this journey are meeting with probation officers instead of with teachers. They're going to court dates instead of to class. Their junior year abroad is instead a trip to a state correctional facility. And they're emerging from their 20s not with degrees in business and English, but with criminal records. This institution is also costing us a lot, about $40,000 a year to send a young person to prison in New Jersey. But here, taxpayers are footing the bill, and what kids are getting is a cold prison cell and a permanent mark against them when they come home and apply for work. There are more and more kids on this journey to adulthood than ever before in the United States, and that's because in the past 40 years, our incarceration rate has grown by 700%. I have one slide for this talk. Here it is. Here's our incarceration rate, about 716 people per 100,000 in the population. Here's the OECD countries. What's more, it's poor kids that we're sending to prison, too many drawn from African American and Latino communities, so that prison now stands firmly between the young people trying to make it and the fulfillment of the American dream.
And so we see, again, as she mentions, these differences in, I hate to call them differences, but issues that individuals from racial and ethnic minorities face that are much more complex than what is presented here. And she also leads me to my next slide, which is looking at socioeconomic status, because when we talk about the amount of people in prisons, most of those are coming from racial and ethnic minorities, but we're also seeing a disproportionate amount of people who are from lower socioeconomic statuses. So we know that education is linked to unemployment. We have higher unemployment rates for people who have lower education levels. We know that there are structural and economic reasons for poverty. So some of those are regional, when we see regions that have low or limited jobs, right? Limited jobs, limited industries that are coming to those areas, or industries that are not stable. We also know that the structural reasons, for example, welfare tends to be a structural reason that keeps people in poverty. People on welfare tend to have kids who end up relying on government services to get by. Some of that is related to economic reasons. It just makes sense for some people to stay on government aid versus get a job. You're making more money that way. You don't have to consider things like childcare. You know, if you're working in one of those low-paying jobs and you have a kid, then you would probably have to pay out more for someone to take care of your kid than you would be making. All of this leads to a lack of power and control in people's lives, people who are coming from a lower socioeconomic status, which leads to a lot of frustration and anger. Again, things that are hard to quantify. I had already talked about the Walpole article where she kind of broke down differences between socioeconomic status and career. So I'm not going to talk about that again. I talked about it in the last episode. I do want to emphasize, and I think I've mentioned this before, but Dr. Bluestein, he's the one of the theorists of the psychology of working theory. He gave a talk where he talked about the impact of unemployment on mental health. And I would also say that there's a strong relationship between poverty and mental health. And so for me, that does a couple things. It indicates that we should be considering the role that career plays in our lives and how it can impact our mental health, but also the complexity of needs that people face whenever they are marginalized. I realize that many of you are thinking that there is so much more going on with each of these populations that I talked about, and that I barely just scratched the surface. You are absolutely right about that. We do have an entire class on diversity, and I could teach an entire class on career issues for diverse populations, but this is not that class. Okay, this is just one episode is all we get. Instead, I wanted to introduce you to some things to consider as you begin working with diverse groups of people, so that you can take this information and move forward with it. Try to educate yourself further through research, through experience, through continuing education, conferences, and so on. As I mentioned, multicultural career counseling isn't necessarily about knowing everything. It's about understanding the impact of culture on career. And so you can certainly do that through just a little bit of information and consideration for culture.